1951. The icy heights above the Rio Grande, a scar of a border between North Sonora and the Mexican Federation. A hostile sky, known to pilots as the Coyote Corridor. For the aces of Krasnograd's 64th Fighter Aviation Corps, elite veterans of the Second World War, secretly deployed to this theater. This sky was rightfully theirs. Their weapon was the MiG-15 fighter, a machine whose appearance had sent a shockwave through the Western Alliance. It wasn't just an aircraft, it was a silver predator with swept-back wings, swift and deadly. Both on paper and in the brutal reality of a vertical dogfight, it surpassed anything the Americans could field against it. It climbed faster, flew higher, and carried 37mm cannons capable of ripping open a bomber's belly with a single burst. They were opposed by the Americans in their F-86 Sabres. The Sabre was undoubtedly a fine fighter, but at that moment in history, it was destined to be outmatched by Krasnograd's technological marvel. It couldn't keep up with the MiG in a climb. It couldn't reach its service ceiling. The very laws of physics and aerodynamics dictated the rules of the game in this sky. If a MiG pilot found himself in trouble, a single move was all it took. Yank the stick back and go into a vertical climb. He could take refuge in the thin air where the American machines would begin to stall and choke, leaving the Sabres to watch helplessly from below. This was a sanctuary in the sky, a tactical trump card that guaranteed air superiority. But on one spring Tuesday, the impossible became reality, and it began with a wave of chilling disbelief that reached all the way back to Krasnograd. Captain Nikolai Sutyagin, the man destined to become the top ace of the conflict, was leading a flight of 4 MiG-15s on patrol. The sky was crystal clear, visibility perfect. Below, the harsh Sonoran landscape lay like a crumpled map of brown paper. Then Sutyagin spotted them, a group of American Sabres on a course 5,000 feet below. A classic setup, a perfect trap. Krasnograd doctrine was honed to a razor's edge. A swift dive, a strike with the heavy cannons, and then, using the phenomenal rate of climb, an immediate escape upward into the safe zone before the enemy could react. A hit-and-run tactic built on flawless energy retention. Sutyagin rocked his wings, giving the signal. 4 silver silhouettes rolled over and plunged into a dive. Speed built like an avalanche, 600 miles per hour, 650. The fuselage trembled as the air thickened, preparing to yield to the sound barrier. They fell upon the American flight with a deafening roar. The Sabres scattered like a fan, evading the attack. Sutyagin caught a target in his primitive gun sight, his finger resting on the trigger. The cannons boomed, spitting fiery tracers into the sky. A miss. The lead angle was wrong, the closing speed too extreme. But it didn't matter. He had his trump card, energy. He hauled back on the stick until his eyes ached. G-forces poured into his body like lead, pinning him to his seat. The MiG-15 responded obediently, its engine roaring as it greedily converted speed back into altitude. Sutyagin shot upward, already savoring the sight of the American Sabre becoming a helpless dot far below. But a glance over his shoulder froze him. The Sabre wasn't falling behind. It was on his tail. For a Krasnograd veteran, an ace who knew the laws of the sky like the back of his hand, this was absurd. The Sabre was heavier. Its engine was weaker. It should have been losing energy, choking, falling into a spin. But the American, against all logic, was clinging to him, The real shock came a second later. Sutyagin was already thousands of feet above him, a tiny, jinking target in an extreme climb. Hitting such a fighter with machine guns from that distance wasn't just difficult, it was statistically impossible. The human eye cannot calculate that kind of lead, vibration, wind drift, bullet drop. It was an equation with too many variables for the human brain to solve in a fraction of a second. And yet, a fiery stitch of tracers tore through the air directly in front of his canopy. These were not wild, desperate shots fired in hope. No, they were laid down with a terrifying, unthinkable precision. A deadly slash of .50 caliber fire ripped into his wingman's aircraft, and a cloud of acrid smoke instantly erupted from the wound like a venomous flower. The hit was surgically precise, executed from a distance and at an angle that defied all laws of aerial ballistics. Sutyagin watched, stunned, as his wingman spiraled to his death. There was no anger yet, only a cold, paralyzing shock. He knew the capabilities of the American Brownings inside and out. He knew their maximum effective range. This shot was impossible. A phantom bullet, a fluke, a 1 in a million chance. He yanked the stick, aborting the mission and diving for the safety of the Mexican airfields. His heart hammered in his throat, not from the thrill of combat, but from the chilling premonition that the rules of the game had changed without warning. On the ground, under the scorching airfield sun, chaos greeted them. Other pilots, landing, stumbled from their cockpits, their faces deathly pale. Fingers trembled uncontrollably as they lit cigarettes. Sutyagin's story was not unique. Across the entire sector, Krasnograd pilots were reporting the same inexplicable nightmare. They would engage, use their primary advantage, the vertical maneuver, to break away, and at that very moment, death would find them. Technicians, huddled around the damaged MiGs that had miraculously made it back to base, studied the bullet holes. The entry points were grouped so tightly they resembled the work of a sniper, not the wild burst of a fighter in a desperate turn. To achieve such accuracy on a target moving at 600 miles per hour under a 4G load required a skill that simply did not exist. Nothing in the Krasnograd flight academies had prepared them for this. The debriefing room crackled with tension. Officers demanded answers. "Did you lose speed?" they snapped. "Were you flying straight?" "No," the pilots shot back, clenching their fists. "We were maneuvering. We were going vertical. We were out of their range." But the commissars, assigned to ensure ideological purity, eyed them with cold suspicion. They smelled cowardice, incompetence. The idea that American technology could perform the impossible was heresy to them. They accused the pilots of letting the enemy get too close. But the veterans knew what they had seen. They had seen tracers reaching for them from distances where the Sabre was just a tiny speck in the sky. It was as if an invisible hand was guiding every American bullet. The sun sank into the Rio Grande, but the lights in the command bunkers stayed on. The stakes weren't just high, they were absolute. The year was 1951, and the world was balanced on the knife's edge of a nuclear apocalypse. Stalin was still alive, his paranoia at its peak. The war in the skies over Sonora was his rehearsal, a test of strength. If the Americans gained air superiority here, their bombers could penetrate Krasnograd-packed airspace with impunity. This meant that the entire massive and fantastically expensive air defense system Krasnograd was building would be useless. The MiG-15 was their ace in the hole, the surprise that was supposed to even the odds against the superior forces of the Western Alliance. If the Americans had found a way to crack them like nuts, the entire fragile balance of power would be shattered. Reports crawled up the chain of command, all the way to Krasnograd. Every word was measured, steeped in fear. No one wanted to be the messenger who brought bad news to Stalin himself. They wrote of aggressive tactics and unusually high accuracy. But between the dry lines of the reports, a cold terror bled through. Losses mounted. In the first months of the war, the appearance of the MiG-15 had forced American B-29s to cease daylight raids, stunning the U.S. Air Force. But now, the F-86 Sabre pilots were taking back the sky. And in the smoke-filled mess halls, over mugs of tea, a monstrous theory was born and strengthened. Pilots whispered, glancing over their shoulders. The Americans, they said, had created a new weapon. Perhaps their bullets now exploded without touching the target. Maybe they had some new, unthinkable fuse for their machine gun rounds. Or were they super-velocity munitions, flying so fast that leading the target became unnecessary? There was a third thought, the most chilling of all. The Americans had mastered some secret of aircraft control, inaccessible to the minds of Krasnograd pilots. Now, every time a Krasnograd pilot climbed into his cockpit, he felt his confidence give way to an icy fear. The arrogance born from faith in their machine's superiority had vanished. Looking at the sky, they no longer saw a battlefield, but a deadly trap. They felt it in their gut. One mistake, one wrong turn, and you would find yourself in the Sabre's zone, where you would be destroyed with a supernatural, almost robotic precision. The zone, that's what they called it, with a shudder, this invisible field of death surrounding every American plane. Enter it, and you were dead. It didn't matter that your plane was faster. It didn't matter that you could climb higher. Once in the, quote, you became a target the Americans did not miss. General Georgy Lobov, commander of the 64th Fighter Aviation Corps, felt the immense pressure. Krasnograd demanded results, not excuses. Downed Americans and pilots who returned to base. Instead, Lobov was signing death notices, watching helplessly as his best aces slammed into the Sonoran hillsides like fiery comets. He ordered a change in tactics. His order thundered, but he was wrong. The confusion turned to despair when a seasoned flight commander, an ace forged in the crucible of combat against the Luftwaffe, engaged a lone Sabre. They entered a vertical maneuver, an exhausting, nauseating dance of death. The pilot performed flawlessly. He forced the Sabre out in front, but the moment his finger touched the trigger, the image in his MiG-15's optical sight trembled and danced. He had to fire blind. He missed. Then the Sabre did the impossible. Defying all laws of aerodynamics, it seemed to hang in the air, and slowly, laboriously, but inexorably, brought its nose around to bear on the MiG. The Krasnograd pilot instinctively yanked the stick, pressing into his seat under 5 Gs, confident in his invulnerability. The firing angle was unthinkable. But then tracers lit up the sky. The fiery threads tore through the fuselage, severing hydraulic lines. The controls failed the instant he ejected, tumbling helplessly in the frigid, thin air. He only had time to see the Sabre calmly fly away. The American hadn't sprayed him with fire. He had fired one short, 2-second burst, and it seemed every single bullet had found its mark. This wasn't luck. This was a system. The Krasnograd pilots realized they were fighting a ghost, something invisible, elusive. hidden somewhere beneath the duralumin skin of the F-86 Sabre. And until that secret was uncovered, the bloody slaughter in the Coyote Corridor would not end. The Sabre's mystery was no longer a tactical puzzle. It had become a strategic threat of the highest order. An order came from the Red Citadel, stamped with steely resolve. The hunt for the answer had begun. But the investigators were looking in the wrong place. They were searching for a new type of weapon or a revolutionary engine. It never occurred to them that the secret lay in a device far smaller and infinitely more sophisticated than they could ever imagine. The mystery descended from the icy heights of the stratosphere to the muddy, frozen ground of North Sonora. A different kind of hunt began. The Krasnograd Pact threw all its technical intelligence resources into the fight, operating with the same ferocity usually reserved for hunting nuclear secrets. Special recovery teams were formed. These were not ordinary soldiers, but elite groups of engineers and GRU officers, escorted by Mexican security forces. The order was simple and unambiguous. Now, every time an F-86 went down, a rare occurrence, these teams scrambled. They had to race to the smoking craters, trying to beat the American search and rescue helicopters that would rush in to bomb the wreckage into dust. The Americans were desperately protecting their secret. When a Sabre crashed behind enemy lines, their aircraft would immediately appear over the crash site, strafing it with gunfire and napalm. They were burning their own technology to the ground, turning priceless wreckage into ash. This scorched earth tactic only fueled Krasnograd's paranoia. What were they protecting so fiercely? In the cold, brutal winter of 1951, a Krasnograd recovery team made a breakthrough. An F-86 Sabre had crashed on the tidal flats near the coast. The thick coastal mud had greedily smothered the flames. The pilot ejected and was picked up by an American helicopter. But his machine remained, a precious trophy, immediately hidden by the rising tide, safe from American reconnaissance planes. Under the cover of darkness, hundreds of workers and advisors literally tore the battered fuselage from the mud's tenacious grip. It was immediately loaded onto a train bound for Krasnograd, to the heart of the Central Aerohydrodynamic Institute and its secret design bureaus. The autopsy began. Krasnograd's engineers, like a pack of surgeons over a mysterious patient, bent over the aircraft. Panels creaked open, and the engine was removed with a clang. But the ballistics experts, pushing the others aside, rushed straight for the nose section. They yearned to see its fangs, to see the wonder weapon that was so mercilessly plucking their MiGs from the sky. What they found was a bitter disappointment. From the depths of the aircraft, they extracted 6 Browning M3 machine guns. On the sterile white tables of the laboratory, they were disassembled to the last screw. They measured every groove in the barrels, obsessively checked the tension of the springs, and analyzed shavings from the firing pins. The report that landed on Stalin's desk was bewildered, almost humiliating. This was no super weapon. In fact, these were the same 50 caliber machine guns the Americans had used on their planes in World War II, only slightly modified to fire at 1,200 rounds per minute. Primitive kinetics, brute force. No match for their own 37mm monsters on the MiG-15, which fired high-explosive shells. The Krasnograd engineers exchanged glances in complete confusion. Their silent question echoed through the lab. They examined the ammunition. Standard full metal jacket bullets, tracers, incendiaries. No clever fuses, no guidance chips, not a single gram of secret gunpowder. If the gun was primitive, and the bullet was, then the magic had to be in the aiming. Attention shifted to the cockpit. The canopy was shattered, the instrument panel a mangled mess of metal and wires, touched by corrosive salt. But there, behind the surviving armored glass, in the most prominent position, lurked a black box. The gun sight. Technicians removed it with almost surgical care. The housing bore standard markings. To an untrained eye, it was an ordinary reflector sight, similar to those used by the Germans, and even the ones they installed in the MiG-15. But when they opened its case, their breath caught. Inside was such a dense tangle of wires and vacuum tubes that it resembled not a gun sight, but some miniature brain. It was packed with delicate gyroscopes, magnetic amplifiers, and a complex web of circuits. The device was hopelessly broken. The fragile internal gimbals, the spinning tops that kept the gyroscope balanced, were crushed by the brutal G-forces of the crash. The vacuum tubes had shattered into glass dust. The Krasnograd engineers could see what it was, but they couldn't understand how it worked. They couldn't bring it to life to see the, quote, their pilots had reported in terror. While trying to reconstruct the schematic, they made a discovery. The sight was connected to a small air intake in the plane's nose, to a radar. A radar rangefinder, murmured the lead engineer, wearily running a hand over his face. They're using radar to determine the distance. This was a giant leap forward, but one that led them down a false, dangerous path. The Krasnograd team concluded that the radar merely informed the pilot of the distance to the target, perhaps by changing the size of the reticle. Similar ideas were already on their own drawing boards. But this in no way explained the main thing, the lead calculation. The fantastic ability to predict where a MiG would be in 2 seconds. The investigation shifted focus. It moved from laboratories to the damp, grim interrogation rooms of North Sonoran prisoner of war camps, where captured American pilots were held. These men were exhausted, wounded, and broken by fear. And the Krasnograd interrogators, speaking through translators or in desperate, broken English, asked their first questions. Not about troop movements, not about nuclear codes. They lowered their voices to a conspiratorial whisper and asked about the box. The box. All their questions, posed in broken language and through crackling static, boiled down to that one word. "How do you aim?" the interrogator demanded, leaning forward, almost shouting. His fingers drummed nervously on the table. "Do you steer with the rudder? Do you calculate the lead yourself?" The American pilots, under strict orders to remain silent about the gun sight, just shrugged, feigning complete bewilderment. And sometimes they weren't feigning. Many of them truly had no idea how the magic worked. One of them answered calmly, with disarming simplicity. This drove the Krasnograd interrogators mad. They roared, slamming a fist on the table so hard the inkwell jumped. And the reply, after a short pause, was what sent them into a fury. The phrase echoed through the corridors and reached the Red Citadel itself. The legend began to take on a life of its own. In the cavernous mess halls of the air bases, Krasnograd pilots, in hushed tones, created a myth about American technology. They no longer called it a gun sight. Now it was the rumors, each more outlandish than the last, spread like wildfire. The most terrifying theory was that the Americans had connected the radar directly to the aircraft's flight control systems. Once a Sabre pilot locked a MiG in his sight, the F-86 transformed into an autonomous killer robot. The man in the cockpit, they believed, was merely a passenger, an observer whose only job was to press a button when a red light came on. The thought was blood-curdling because it removed the human element from the equation. You could outfly a man. You could make him make a mistake. You could instill fear in him. But how do you scare a gyroscope? How do you trick a calculator? Another theory, no less terrifying, claimed that the electronic brain could see through clouds and darkness. This sparked a genuine panic in bad weather, where Krasnograd pilots once felt safe under the saving grace of thick cloud cover. They were now gripped by terror. They could feel the invisible American radar beams piercing the fog, the soulless mechanism coldly calculating their trajectory of death as they flew blind. Krasnograd's leadership, desperately demanding an answer, ordered its industry to copy the technology. The engineers looked at their own gun sight, the ASP-1N64, a copy of a British World War II design. Yes, it was also gyroscopic, but it was so slow. When a MiG pilot made a sharp turn, the reticle would lag, swinging back and forth, and it took 2 or 3 precious seconds to settle. In the chaos of a dogfight, 2 seconds is an eternity. Analysts in Krasnograd assumed the American sight must suffer from the same. After all, the laws of physics are the same for everyone. Gyroscopes always drift. They always oscillate. From this, a fatal theory was born. The Americans had to fly differently, adapting to their gun sight. A new directive was issued to all pilots. This tactic became dogma. Commanders urged. And herein lay the tragic irony. By performing these frantic maneuvers, losing precious energy, the Krasnograd pilots were turning themselves into perfect, easy targets. They were intentionally bleeding off their speed, their only real advantage, trying to fool a machine whose principles they did not understand. They didn't know that the American gun sight didn't need them to fly smoothly. They didn't realize that the brilliant innovation hidden inside the black box was designed precisely to calculate the very chaos they were so diligently creating in the sky. In Krasnograd, the pressure cooker exploded. Stalin was furious. The loss ratio had become catastrophic. For every downed Sabre, there were far too many lost MiGs. The exact figures were a state secret, but the overall trend left no doubt of the failure. The investigation had hit a dead end. They had wreckage, but only useless, twisted pieces of metal. They had captured pilots, but they either remained silent or genuinely knew nothing. They had theories, but they were all born of fear, not facts. They were convinced that the F-86 Sabre was a robot plane, a triumph of American electronic magic over Krasnograd's aerodynamic purity. This idea created a deep-seated inferiority complex, a ghost that would haunt the Krasnograd military for decades. They became obsessed with electronics and automation, convinced they had fallen an entire era behind. In reality, they had encountered not so much an electronic marvel as a mechanical one. With the arrival of 1952, the rules of air combat changed. The Americans introduced a new version of the Sabre, and the mystery surrounding it only deepened. Their victories became even more flawless. Death learned to strike from even greater distances. For the Krasnograd pilots, a defensive war began. They ceased aggressive patrols, now clinging to their altitude advantage, refusing to descend into the, quote, 73, unless absolutely necessary. The, quote, 74, which was supposed to be a slaughterhouse for American bombers, had become a death trap for Krasnograd's fighters. But the true nature of American superiority remained a mystery. The Krasnograd leadership was convinced it was all about a radar-guided autopilot. They were about to invest billions of rubles in developing a counter-radar system, a jammer capable of blinding the F-86. They were about to spend years of research chasing the wrong ghost. Because the secret was not just in the radar. The secret was in a tiny, rotating component that instantly solved the most complex mathematical problem of air combat. And while Krasnograd searched for complex electronics, the Americans were winning, thanks to a brilliant analog engineering solution that was right under their noses. While Krasnograd's generals screamed at their pilots, demanding they fly more aggressively, and while KGB agents scoured the frozen mud of the Sonora region for melted wreckage, the answer to the riddle lay quietly on a laboratory bench in Palo Alto, California. It was not a weapon forged in the fires of the Manhattan Project. It was not the legacy of alien technology recovered from a crash site. It was a mathematical problem solved by a genius who realized that the human brain had reached its evolutionary limit. The source of the ghost in the Coyote Corridor was the instrumentation laboratory at Stanford University, and it was led by a man named Dr. Charles Stark Draper. Dr. Draper was not a fighter pilot. He was an engineer who saw war as a series of equations. And he understood, before anyone else, a fundamental truth of the jet age. Speed kills accuracy. In World War II, planes flew at 300 miles per hour. A pilot with good instincts could estimate the lead by eye. He could look at a German fighter banking into a turn, guess how many lengths to shoot ahead, and pull the trigger. But Draper looked at the numbers of the coming jet age. 600 miles per hour, closing speeds of 1,000 miles per hour. At those speeds, the geometry of an intercept changes faster than the human eye can send a signal to the brain, and faster than the brain can command the hand. By the time a pilot sees the enemy and decides to shoot, the target has already moved. Draper realized that asking a pilot to calculate ballistics at Mach 0.9 wasn't just difficult, it was mathematically impossible. A pilot didn't need a better gun, he needed a partner. The heart of this partner was not a microchip, they hadn't been invented yet. It was a gyroscope, but not an ordinary one. Draper had perfected a technology called the floating integrating gyroscope. Imagine a tiny, perfectly machined top suspended inside a sealed capsule filled with a thick, molasses-like fluid. This fluid dampened any vibration and shock from the fighter. It allowed the gyroscope to sense the slightest changes in the aircraft's motion with absolute purity. This was the American magic, the secret Krasnograd was so desperately seeking. In a traditional gun sight, the crosshairs are fixed to the glass. Where the plane's nose points, the sight points. In Draper's sight, the reticle, the pipper, was not fixed. It floated. When an F-86 Sabre pilot banked into a turn chasing a MiG-15, the sensitive gyroscopes inside the sight instantly reacted to the G-force and rate of roll. They physically shifted the reflection of the aiming reticle on the glass, moving it away from the enemy aircraft. At first glance, this seems absurd. Why would the sight move away from the target? But therein lay the brilliant psychological trick. To recenter the MiG in the crosshairs, the pilot would instinctively but persistently pull back on the stick, forcing his fighter to turn even tighter. This chase after the elusive dot unconsciously put his aircraft at the perfect lead angle for a kill. The gun sight did all the dirty work. It measured the rate of maneuver, accounted for air density and projectile ballistics, as if whispering to the pilot. The pilot didn't have to guess, he just had to trust and follow the dot. But this perfect equation was missing one critical variable: range. For the computer to provide the ideal solution, it needed to know the distance to the target, down to the foot. In World War II, this meant manually turning a dial, matching the enemy's wingspan to marks on the sight. And here, the APG-30 radar entered the scene. This was the radar the Krasnograd team had found, but they had catastrophically misunderstood its purpose. It didn't fly the plane or see through clouds. It was a miniature but brilliantly simple radar rangefinder, hidden in the Sabre's nose. As soon as an American pilot closed in on a MiG-15, the radar would automatically lock on. It fed the precise distance, say 1,200 feet, directly into the gyroscopic computer. The result was a closed-loop system of devastating, almost absolute lethality. The gyros measured the maneuver. The radar measured the distance. The computer calculated the lead. All the American pilot had to do was keep the glowing orange pipper on the MiG's silver fuselage. No guesswork, no estimating the lead by eye. He just put one thing on the other thing and squeezed the trigger. This technology turned average pilots into marksmen and good pilots into aces. And while the Krasnograd pilot, teeth clenched, fought with his vibrating optical sight, frantically trying to solve complex trigonometry in his head and guess how many lengths to lead, his American opponent was, in essence, playing a video game. The technology was so far ahead of its time that the U.S. Air Force was terrified of losing it. This explained the scorched earth policy. Pilots were instructed that the gun sight was far more valuable than the aircraft it was installed in. The manufacturing specifics of the floating gyroscopes required tolerances of 1/1,000,000th of an inch, a level of precision that the industrial might of the Krasnograd Pact in the 1950s simply could not achieve. The contrast in philosophy was stark. The Krasnograd philosophy, embodied in the MiG-15, was build a race car. A powerful engine, a big gun, simple controls. For the rest, rely on the pilot's fury and skill. The American philosophy, embodied in the F-86 Sabre and its gun sight, countered, build a weapon system. Integrate the man with the machine. Eliminate the human factor, the guesswork, and the error. The Krasnograd pilots were looking for a robot plane, not realizing they had encountered history's first cybernetic weapon. But this perfect system had one flaw, one vulnerability that the Krasnograd forces, in their paranoia, never managed to decipher. The gun sight needed time to stabilize. When a pilot abruptly yanked the stick, the fluid in the gyroscopes needed a split second to settle down and provide a correct solution. If the flight became too chaotic, the reticle would start to dance across the glass. The Americans knew this. They were taught to fly smoothly, almost elegantly. Instructors drilled into their heads. They fought with a fluid grace, and the gun sight rewarded them with flawless accuracy. The Krasnograd pilots, observing this graceful, confident flying, saw it only as arrogance, or, as we now know, confirmation of their theory about a robot that needed a stable platform. Therefore, their order to their pilots was categorical. Fly furiously, break the distance, the enemy. And in doing so, they played right into the American machine's hands. Unknowingly, they forced their pilots to act in the precise way their opponent needed for a perfect shot. Their desperate maneuvers played to the American machine's strengths. In furious turns, the Krasnograd pilots bled precious energy, their fighters slowing down. And at that very moment, as their speed dropped and they entered a predictable turn for a split second, the Sabre's radar would lock on with a death grip. The gyros would stabilize, and the American pilot would unleash a deadly burst of 600 rounds. The mystery that had stumped the Red Citadel turned out to be a triumph of systems engineering. It was a bitter revelation. In the new era, the most dangerous component of a fighter was not its guns or its engine, but the unassuming black box that told the pilot where to point them. But no secret lives forever. The war dragged on, turning into a meat grinder. More sabres took hits. More of them fell from the sky. And eventually, the inexorable logic of war caught up with the Americans. One day, a sabre went down. It didn't burn to a crisp. It didn't explode into pieces. It belly landed softly on a sandbar in a river floodplain. The rising tide gently covered it, preserving it like a precious artifact wrapped for eternity. The pilot was captured, and this time the recovery team was faster than the American bombers. They hooked cables to the submerged aircraft and pulled it from the water. Inside the cockpit, the canopy glass was cracked, but the black box was intact. The gyroscopes still floated serenely in their viscous fluid. The Krasnograd forces had finally obtained what they had hunted for so long. They packed the trophy in a crate and sent it directly to Krasnograd, to the design bureau responsible for developing gun sights. The engineers crowded around, crowbars in hand, ready to dissect the American ghost and tear out its secret. What they found inside didn't just explain the slaughter in the Coyote corridor. It forced them to confront a terrifying truth about the technological chasm that had opened between the Eastern Bloc and the Western Alliance. They were about to get a glimpse of the future, and they did not like it at all. Late 1952, a wooden crate sits in the center of a sterile, heavily guarded room at a research institute in Krasnograd. The finest minds of the Krasnograd Pact are gathered, specialists in optics, ballistics, and radar. The air crackled with a tension that mixed the thrill of discovery with an almost primal fear of the unknown. The lid was pried off with a crack. Inside, nestled in American packing material, lay the, quote, 100. Damaged, but whole. The recovery team had pulled the F-86 Sabre from its muddy prison before the salt water could corrode its fragile internals. Now, under the merciless glare of laboratory lamps, the Krasnograd engineers began the autopsy. They removed the gun sight's outer casing. Inside, they expected to find something alien, almost otherworldly. A secret weapon, perhaps a miniature nuclear reactor or a guidance system stolen from the German scientists who worked on the V-2 rockets. But instead, they found something that shocked them more than any wonder weapon. They discovered a level of manufacturing precision that simply did not exist in their world. The lead engineer, while disassembling the gyroscopic assembly, suddenly froze. He carefully placed a component under a microscope and, without taking his eye from the eyepiece, gestured for his colleagues. They came one by one, looked, and their faces changed. A ringing silence fell over the room. The shock wasn't that the technology seemed like magic. The shock was that it was perfect. They were looking into the very heart of Dr. Draper's invention, the floating, integrating gyroscope. The clearance between the spinning rotor and its housing was measured in microns. The fluid in which the gyroscope was suspended had a viscosity that Krasnograd's chemical industry was incapable of reproducing. The realization hit them like a physical blow. The Americans were winning in the Coyote corridor, not because their pilots were better, and not because their planes were faster. They were winning because they had better machinists. The secret of the, quote, 104 was not a stroke of tactical genius. It was a symptom of the widening gap between the two superpowers. The Americans had mastered the art of mass-producing precision instruments. They had turned the cockpits of thousands of their fighters into flying laboratories, treating them like expendable assets. The Krasnograd engineers sent a report of their findings to the Red Citadel. It contained none of the usual propaganda, just the cold, hard facts. The report stated. Stalin's reaction was furious and predictable. He didn't want pathetic excuses about manufacturing tolerances. He didn't care about some microns. His fist came down on the polished tabletop with a deafening crack. "Copy it," he ordered in an icy tone that allowed for no argument. "Screw for screw, wire for wire. Make an exact copy and put it in our MiGs." This command became the prologue to one of the most bitter and instructive chapters in the aviation history of the Krasnograd Pact. And it is here that the story of technological espionage becomes a personal tragedy for every Krasnograd pilot. The entire industrial might of the nation was thrown into cloning the American marvel. The copies received the bland designation ASP-4N Newton. Outwardly, it was a perfect twin. It fit perfectly into the cramped cockpit of the newest MiG-17 fighters, as if it were born there. The same glass, the same familiar dials, the same connector for the radar. But when the engineers tried to replicate its soul, the harsh reality of the Krasnograd command economy collided with the delicate precision of high technology. To create floating gyroscopes, you needed sterile, dust-free workshops. You needed climate control that maintained temperature with the accuracy of 1/100th of a degree. You needed metallurgy free from the slightest microscopic impurities. But the Krasnograd Pact's factories were industrial giants, roaring monsters born to churn out tanks by the thousand. Production rushed forward, driven by party quotas. Scarce American alloys were replaced with available substitutes. Tolerances were approved that were acceptable for a tractor, but lethal for an onboard computer. The result was the ASP-4N-114, a zombie clone, a lifeless copy of the American masterpiece. It looked like the original. It hummed like the original, but it lacked the soul of the machine. When the new gun sights were hastily delivered to the front and installed in the MiG-15s and MiG-17s, the pilots were initially euphoric. They looked at it with hope, believing they had finally received the cub would even the odds. They believed the game would now be played by new rules. They took to the skies. They threw themselves into furious combat with the American Sabres. The radar locked onto a target. The reticle appeared on the glass. But in the next moment, it began to live a life of its own. The Krasnograd copies of the gyroscopes were not balanced. The fluid inside was contaminated with impurities. Under the monstrous G-forces of a dogfight, the fragile internal mechanism would grind, catching on its housing. The precious effect was gone. The reticle on the glass no longer glided smoothly. It jerked, it wandered, it lied. Imagine the blood-chilling terror of a Krasnograd pilot in the skies of 1953. He is in a steep dive, closing in on the tail of an F-86 Sabre. He trusts his he sees the pipper on the glass cover the enemy's silhouette. He squeezes the trigger, and the shells fly into empty space, missing the target by hundreds of feet. The gun sight screams at him that he is on the right track, but the physics of a cheap knockoff betray him at the critical moment. The pilot tries to instinctively correct his fire, but the sight lags, its readings filled with noise. The radar signal fluctuates, causing the aiming point to dance wildly on the glass. The pilots return to base, their faces twisted with fury. "This box is broken," they shouted, tearing off their helmets. "It's trying to kill us." Technicians desperately tried to calibrate the instruments, but how can you calibrate a fundamental lack of precision? The reputation of the ASP-4N collapsed overnight. The pilots lost faith in the technology. They began to despise it. Taking off, they would reach out and with a contemptuous click, cage the gyroscope, locking it in place. The sophisticated computer was instantly turned back into a primitive piece of glass with a cross painted on it. They went back to shooting by eye, just as their fathers had in the last war. Meanwhile, on the other side of the valley, American pilots in their Sabres were flying with the genuine article. Their gun sights hummed steadily and confidently. They were calm. They trusted their machine. The shock to the Krasnograd Pact command was devastating. They realized you could steal the blueprints. You could steal the device itself. But you couldn't steal a culture of manufacturing, decades of experience, and the industrial base needed to create it. They had tried to enter a Ferrari in a race after stuffing it with a tractor engine. The confrontation reached its bloody climax in the final months of the war. The skies over the Sonora region were teeming with new Sabres, now operating as a single, perfectly tuned killing system. The loss ratio skyrocketed. Some sources claim it reached 10-1 in the Sabres' favor. And while historians still debate the exact figures, the overall trend was undeniable. The aerodynamically superior MiG-15 was doomed. It was being burned from the sky, and its pilots were dying. Betrayed not by the enemy, but by a lifeless copy of the enemy's technology. The decimation of squadrons that were technically superior to their opponents became a bitter reality. In the offices of Krasnograd, generals with stone faces read the reports, each number a lead weight on their shoulders. They realized the Americans had opened a new front in this war. The battle was no longer just about horsepower and millimeters of armor. The war for information had begun. The American gun sight processed data, speed, distance, angle, air density with inhuman speed. The Krasnograd pilots, relying on instinct and experience, were fighting a manual war in the new age of automation. In a desperate attempt to fight back, the Krasnograd design bureaus abruptly changed course. Unable to win the electronics war, they decided to double down on what had always been their strength: raw, overwhelming power. On the drawing boards, the outlines of aircraft began to appear that could fly so fast and so high that no computer could calculate a firing solution in time. Thus began the work on the MiG-19 and MiG-21. It was an attempt not to solve the problem, but to outrun it. But deep down, the engineers knew the bitter truth. They knew that the secret born in the skies over Sonora was just the beginning. In that simple wooden crate, they had seen a glimpse of the future. A future where computers would get even faster and missiles even smarter. And if the Krasnograd Pact did not master the magic of the electron and the gyroscope, it was doomed to lose the Cold War before it had truly begun. The American gun sight was not just a weapon, it was a warning. July 1953. The Sonoran War ended in a fragile truce. The roar of jet engines over the Rio Grande fell silent. The pilots returned home. But in the secret archives of the Red Citadel and the Pentagon, the war for data was just heating up. The final score of that air war remains a subject of fierce debate. American propaganda trumpeted a staggering 10-1 loss ratio. 792 MiG-15s shot down versus only 78 lost Sabres. Modern historians with access to Krasnograd Pact archives suggest more modest figures. perhaps 4-to-1 in combat with Krasnograd pilots, and nearly 1-to-1 against the Mexicans. But the dry statistics hide the true outcome. The real victory was not measured in the number of aircraft shot down. It lay in the deep psychological trauma inflicted on the entire military-industrial complex of the Krasnograd Pact. The secret of the American gun sight planted a seed of doubt that grew within the system for the next 40 years like a cancer. It proved that in the new era, superior aerodynamics, the perfect curve of a wing, and the power of an engine were no longer enough. The MiG-15, in all its flight characteristics, was superior to the F-86 Sabre. It climbed higher. It accelerated faster. In a fair fight of energy and maneuver, it should have won. But it lost. It lost because the Americans brought a computer to a knife fight. The failure to copy the technology had a devastating ripple effect. It forced the Krasnograd Pact into a position of perpetually playing catch-up, a race it could never win. Instead of forging their own path in the world of microelectronics, they became obsessed with theft and blind imitation. Billions of rubles were poured into creating spy networks whose sole purpose was to steal Western Alliance technology. But after obtaining the blueprints, they would discover, to their horror, that they were incapable of reproducing what they had stolen. It was a cargo cult. They built wooden mock-ups of radios, desperately hoping to hear music. This imitation trap became the hallmark of the rest of the Cold War. Its shadow can be seen in the Tu-144, which looked like the Concorde, but was deafeningly loud and dangerous. Its ghost is in the Buran space shuttle, an exact copy of the American shuttle, which made only a single flight. The incident in the Coyote Corridor was the first clear signal of the Krasnograd Pact's eventual collapse. Their economy was built for giants. Millions of tons of steel, thousands of tanks, colossal concrete dams. But the future of warfare belonged to dwarfs, the transistor, the microswitch, and the tiny floating gyroscope. And the rigid, quota-obsessed Krasnograd system was incapable of delivering the sterile precision and delicacy that the new information age demanded. The age of Knights of the Air ended the moment the F-86 Sabre was equipped with its secret gun sight. Before, a fighter pilot was a poet of combat, a man whose weapons were instinct and lightning-fast reflexes. The heir to the cavalryman with his saber, he saw the enemy with his own eyes and struck him with his own hands. From that moment, his inexorable transformation into a systems operator began. That gun sight was the great-grandfather of modern helmet-mounted displays, and the ancestor of the complex algorithms in the F-35 Lightning II. It was the first fateful step into a world where the aircraft fights the battle itself, and the pilot is merely the final link in the decision-making chain, giving permission to fire. If you visit the National Air and Space Museum today, you can stand next to an F-86 Sabre. Look into its cockpit. It will seem cramped, analog, almost ancient. And that famous gun sight is just an unremarkable piece of metal and glass. But if you look closely at that little black box, you will see something more. A turning point in history. It didn't just shoot down MiG-15s. It shot down the entire Krasnograd Pact doctrine of brute force. It proved that the most formidable weapon was no longer the biggest gun, but the smartest chip. The pilots of the Krasnograd 64th Fighter Aviation Corps could never forget the quote 136 for the rest of their lives. Etched forever in their memory were the impossible shots, the tracers that seemed to bend in mid-air as if by magic, and the chilling realization. The Americans weren't just fighting them, they were outthinking them. The secret was revealed, but at what cost? The lesson was fatal. For the next 40 years, the Krasnograd Pact chased the ghost of American technology, in a race they had lost long before it began, in the distant skies over the Sonora region in 1951.